taking its time.
Great. Here we are, Bruce.
Great. I think I can get us started. So just to open the meeting, I think everybody knows everybody. We don't have anyone different at this meeting than I think everybody's already met. Am I correct in that? So if that's the case, I don't think we need any self-introductions. And I think we can just to see, go into the first item, which is if you have any comments about the October 20th meeting notes, love to hear them. Or any questions? Not hearing anybody having any questions or comments, I think we go on to our next item, which is an update on the buildable lands inventory. We really appreciated meeting with you last time to talk about that. Eric was able to make some changes. I know we worked with Jerry on that. So I don't know, do we start with Jerry or start with Eric?
Well, I mean, it's probably for Eric to run through this.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the BLI is important because it's the supply side of our supply demand piece, but we just want to take advantage of the advisory committee's, knowledge of the area to make sure we get this right.
Yeah, I can start with sort of the changes in the BLI. Really, it's going to be the changes from the adopted BLI with our relook and bringing in some of the discussion from the last TAC meeting that we had. So if everyone can see my screen here, we went over the sites, if you recall, at the last meeting, and I'll just go over the actual changes that we made. So we had talked about sort of the buildable area in these lots being what seemed to be high for what was available. And so with now understanding the difference between vacant and redevelopable, I think we've cleaned up these to a more accurate representation of what is actually redevelopable. And basically what we're seeing on really these three big sites is that, we know that there is existing development. It's relatively new, and we're seeing continued investment in the properties on the vacant portions. So that indicates to us that these properties are not likely to be fully redeveloped and the buildings demolished, which is what was indicated in the BLI, the adopted BLI. So, for example, Sherwood Industrial Park here, these are all relatively new buildings since 2000. We have an application here to fill in this pad here, and originally it was showing 12.16 acres, assuming all of this would be redeveloped in here. We've just updated that to 2.75 to account for this buildable pad, and the constraints would still be not accounted for in that 2.75. So that's kind of what we did with all of these. This one, 3.95. We have an application for a modification to this site plan. So, we know that they're working with what is here and adding to it as opposed to a larger redevelopment. So this one also got dropped down from 13.95 to 4.5. Same with this one here. We know that they are also investing in the property. And so this was actually just converted straight to developed is what we did here. The reason why there's constraints here. And so there's really not a lot of buildable left outside of constraints. And so that's why this one got converted just straight to developed. These two have, actual pads that are pretty clean pads. The other change that we made is converting this existing property that is now owned by the city to exempt as opposed to potentially redevelopable, since it's now owned by the city, be used for public improvements. So that's a summary of the changes. We actually did not, I'll go to this map here that sort of summarizes a new clean map. We actually did not, we talked a lot last time about the constraints and potentially making changes to the constraints. Constraints are all of these hatches shown in, or just the hatched area. based on the relook, the really partly the technical skills, time, resources needed to go in and actually update, these detailed natural resource and other layer, wasn't really, maybe could have done it, but sort of not really within the scope. And so instead of opening that up for potential marginal changes of, 15% slope to 10% slope, we just left all the constraints exactly how they were in the last adopted BLI. So no changes to the constraints layer. We just went through this kind of exercise of fine tuning the buildable land inventory on a lot by lot basis. So just really quickly, those were the changes from the last BLI. I can pause there. Actually, I'll probably just pause, see if there's any questions. If not, I can get into sort of the outcomes of that.
Eric, this is Dan. Were there changes to any of the other lots that we looked at more on the west side of town or south? Because some of those are pretty significant, those changes you just made here. I'm just curious if there were any others.
Yeah, no, there weren't. And the reason being is that we thought those were accurate. So just as an example, on the west side here along Highway 99, these are showing as potentially redevelopable here in blue. These ones are showing as vacant. And, when you look at it, it's a little hard to tell, but we do believe that that's accurate, that these properties will, they're mostly vacant and truly underutilized. So we think these will, redevelop at their full vacant, capacity or redevelopable capacity. Same with areas in Brookman, no development here. So really no reason to change those. I think the biggest change was just really taking a close look at the existing development and really making a call on whether we think it's going to redevelop within the time frame or not. So no changes to these other properties to the south.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, get into the outcomes. The total unconstrained buildable acres is 208 acres right now. That includes commercial and industrial. That's a change from the last BLI of about 40 acres, 40. So we had 249 in the last BLI. Right now we're at 208, and that's just from the changes that I went over. And the sort of on the flip side of that, the number of acres that we're showing as no development capacity increased by the same amount. And then the other change would be that we had annexed back in this Tonkin employment area. You can see properties have actually been annexed into the city boundary now. And so instead of being in future development Tonkin, we actually brought them into employment industrial, and that changed the short-term supply as well. So a bump up in employment industrial land because it was annexed, a loss to the Tonkin future development. So it was 10 tax lots, 36 acres converted from Tonkin future to employment industrial. I think that's kind of the story here. I won't go over all these little things in each zone, but if you have questions on any specific zones or any of this, I can answer that. I'll just go over these two tables and then we can get into questions. The next table was about the really showing the size of the properties and the amount of land available at each lot size. And I think the story here is that you can see how it's broken up: less than 1 acre, 1 to 2 acres, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, and then 10 to 50. When I look at this, I think that the takeaway here is this section here, the 10 to 50. Sorry, this right hand one here. No longer have any properties in the 10 to 50 acre. I think we just had one before that we switched, that had a 30 acre that we switched over to developed as part of this change. And so most of these are going to stay about the same, kind of a lot of smaller lots that have development capacity, but at this point, nothing in the 10 to 50. And then this just tells the number of tax lots that are in each size category. So really the change here was reduction of 40 acres of industrial land within the 10 to 50 acre category. And then the last table is the short-term supply, and there is a definition in the Oregon revised statutes for short-term supply. I just did exactly what we did in the last BLI, with the exception of the changes that we mentioned at the top, and then the change of bringing land from future Tonkin to employment industrial. That actually changed the short-term supply. So we're looking at property that's in city limits, and there's some other parameters, but the only change once we'd actually ran all the analysis was a reduction in 5 acres of the short-term supply. And so that's the 40 acres 40 buildable acres that were lost when we made those flips of the initial properties. And then we brought in 36 acres from the urban growth boundary actually into the city limits. And so that increased our short-term supply by 36. And so the net is 5, in a reduction of 5 acres to the short-term supply. So in terms of short-term supply for commercial, we have 25 acres, and short-term supply for industrial, we have 94 acres. And that's the sort of relatively high level analysis we've done so far. So next steps to get this to a final product would be to do all the sort of written analysis to accompany, the changes to the map and to the tables. But happy to answer any questions if you guys have any.
Is there any consideration of assemblage potential within the lots by size?
Good question. I didn't really look at that as part of this analysis, but we potentially could.
Yeah, we could probably look at the map. You've had so few.
Yeah.
sites.
Oh, sure.
That
Yeah.
probably would be a really good idea, because assemblage is really a challenge here for us.
Oh, it's hard. Yeah.
Very hard.
So
What does that mean? What does assemblage mean? What does that mean?
Well, when you have a lot of small parcels and they're not terribly usable as small parcels, 2-acre parcels, you really can't use it for the kind of target industries we're looking for. And so you really need to encourage the property owners to join together. And so maybe you could create, I'm making it up, a 10-acre equivalent of a 10-acre or a 15-acre parcel, or
I see.
even larger. But that's all voluntary in the state. It's a little different from another state that I worked in. And so you just have to have property owners that are willing to have some kind of an agreement with their neighbors. And that's fairly hard. That's actually very hard to do. I think we're not the only city that has a real challenge with that.
And you might need to be adjacent too, probably, it sounds like.
Right. They need to be adjacent. And a lot of times a developer will try to do an assembly, but it's a high risk strategy, particularly once they figure out what you're trying to do.
Thanks for the color.
Okay. So I got a question. So the actual write-up, I can't remember, Jerry and Eric, is that something that Jerry's doing from this data?
I think either I can do it as well.
If Eric does it, I can roll it. I can just roll it into our report.
Okay.
They're typically in a one report. I was just going through that in my head too. Am I going to provide Eric with the text, or is he going to provide me with this text?
My thought was that I would do it once we kind of got if there are any changes, any feedback, we can incorporate that into the final draft text.
And if there's a way that we could also incorporate the assemblage potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think the assemblage comes down, typically you're supposed to come up with strategies, how to address some of your issues. And one of your issues seems like it's going to clearly be a lack of large lots.
Right.
And so what could I potentially do? Assemblage is something we often look at. I mean, actually looking at your map, maybe in Tonkin area, there's some chances for some assemblage, but you typically have to walk through, here's things I could potentially do to address this issue.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. There's a few areas, maybe the interior of Tonkin, that
these ones
over time, when a road gets in there, when Ice Age Drive gets in there, there could be some assemblage, and, maybe it's through a broker who puts the lots all under one listing or something of that sort. I've heard of that happening. And so maybe, maybe there's a potential, because that's where you have a few of the 9-acre parcels, 9, maybe 10-acre parcels, even though they usually have easements and power lines and whatever going through them in that particular area. But that's an area that has some potential for assemblage, I think.
Right.
But yeah, we can definitely consider that for the final text as well, final numbers and text.
So do we have a map that shows all of the 95 acres and the however many commercial acres that were included?
I don't have one right now, but I can definitely make one. Just showing the acreage by location, by parcel.
Like what all those properties are.
Yep, we can get that.
Was that Susanna asking?
Yeah.
that? Okay, got it.
Yep, we can get that.
So what else do we have to talk about on the BLI?
It's really just comments that people have things they think are missing or things that we missed, like constraints. But I think we've gone through this on one round already. So if no one has any, we can start just proceeding like this is where we're going with, and then move on from it. We're always open to taking late input on this stuff, but certain point we just have to say this is, I think one of the advantage, Eric, the way you handled it is you're not litigating everything that happened in the last EOA. We're just sort of marginally working on the edge. And changes are all stuff that are pretty easy to see what went on. I mean, a lot of those improvements are pretty nice improvements that weren't there in the last time.
Right. And so, yeah, that just summarizes the change again. Yeah, no change to the constraints layer. Really just taking a close look at some of these that we thought, really should be categorized as developed or categorized as partially redeveloped with a correction to the amount of buildable acreage that's there. So yeah, just those lots that we went over. So
if I may jump in for just a moment, we did have some discussion during the last meeting about just definitions of redevelopable versus partially developed. So I was just wondering if any of those distinctions made it into the BLI.
Yeah, so I think the distinction, the clarification that sort of I took away from the last meeting was, when we're go back to this map, showing the buildable acres here. I wasn't really clear why they were showing this 12.16. It seemed like either the constraints weren't being accounted for or something else. But what was happening is that they were shown as potentially redevelopable based on the strike price model. And then really, all of this land in here was considered redevelopable. And so that was different than the vacant portion of I guess just vacant properties, as opposed to vacant. And so we left all the vacant properties, vacant at full capacity and just updated these. So that's really the only distinction that I made. What was the other word you mentioned? Partially redevelopable?
No, I think that there was some, maybe it was just confusion on my part, but it seemed like there was some mixing of terms during our last meeting on something that was partially developed, with partial development potential versus something that is redevelopable,
I got you.
that it has already been developed.
Yep.
And
I
so
got you.
it looks like, site number 2 here is a perfect distinction of all 3 of those uses kind of coming in together.
Right.
But I just wanted to make sure that.
Well, I think for this parcel too is actually one of the problems with the strike price model, where you've got to be careful with it because it goes on the whole parcel, and a good third to half of this site is constrained, but they'll take the value of the land and they'll apply it against the total square footage. Except my net is actually much smaller. So
that's why it got included.
It cuts the value in half.
And
then it makes it seem redevelopable, but And it's something we've run into. We use that model, variations of it a lot. You just have to like look for when this happens.
Yep. So I think, yeah, I think we did capture that issue where we didn't bring this entire 12.16 as developed. You know, we left it as potentially redevelopable, and then just included this this vacant pad. So it's kind of a workaround, I guess. Instead of designating it as partially redevelopable, we just have it as
Partially developed.
partially developed. Yes, thank you. It was probably me mixing all this stuff up. So
Got it. Okay.
apologize. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
That's a good clarification. All right.
Any other comments?
All right. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Let
Thank you all.
Jerry
Should we
move
now
on.
go into the demand analysis, which Jerry's going to present?
Okay. Yes. Should I pull up my presentation, or do you have it there? I'm happy to go either way.
I can pull it up. What do you prefer? It doesn't matter.
Actually, if I can share it, I'll do it on mine. Then
Okay.
I want to keep asking you to move stuff. So
Yep, go for it.
Yep, you can share.
hang on. I was thinking you were doing it, so now I got to find it. Hang on. Sorry. All right. All right. So I got to show the slideshow. Hang on. All right. So this is the employment land needs. We talked about what we've got. The next step sort of is take a look at what you need. This builds off some of the work we had done previously on target industries, but really most of this is based on a lot of the trend analysis and things we're seeing. If you take a look at the base year employment estimate, these numbers are all for what we've defined as the urban growth boundary of the city of Sherwood. There's pieces of the county we have to count in that. There's a bit of an assumption as to what that is, since it isn't completely figured out which jurisdiction eventually it'll be in, but this is what Sherwood's counting as part of the urban growth boundary. So you have 2020 employment, which is the last year we have full employment of 6,669 employees in these sectors in this region. We looked at the growth rate in the county over from 2020 to 2022, took that growth rate, applied it to these base numbers to come up with an estimate what we think the 2022 numbers would be in this area, which is about 6,895. We convert the total employment to actual total, covered employment, total employment. Covered employment is employment that's covered by unemployment insurance, and that's what the QCW data is. And so self-employed individuals and individuals aren't counted. We use the same conversion factors that were used in the previous work, came up with an estimate of just 9,449 estimate in 2022, which includes all employment, so self-employed as well. We took a look at a couple scenarios, 3 scenarios actually, so a trio of scenarios. Scenario 1 is basically the regional forecast. This is a forecast based on the Department of Oregon Employment Department's forecast for the next 10 years, which is about a 2% growth rate. You apply the growth rate by industry to your particular sector, and it gives you a 2% growth rate. You take a look at your sectors with the scenario 2, which is what your growth rate has been from 2012 to 2022, and you extend it out. It's about a 3.4% growth rate because the city of Sherwood's been doing better. What we did for scenario 3, which is one we're sort of recommending, which is an adjusted, we capped some of the growth in some of the industries. And we modified it a bit based on your target industries. So you do a little bit better on your target industries. You can't really sustain a growth rate of 3.4%. Probably it's going to start moderating as you get larger. So we sort of tone that down at the same time. And it's a growth rate of about 3.1%. So with that, your 2022, 9,449 would go up to 17,340. So about 70, just under 7,900 new employees in the urban growth boundary. And of that, there's still some areas that show some decline just because that's what we saw in our trends. A lot of resale, a lot of wholesale trade, manufacturing and construction, target industries and industries you've actually done really well with on your trends. So we did move the manufacturing around, which is going to be a negative if you took your Sherwood trends and assumed you did a little bit better. One of the trends we know about is you've actually attracted some recent manufacturers that aren't showing up in the 2020 numbers. So if we put those in, that would not be a negative. And so we sort of overrode that. And we just break it out by 5-year increments. Not very exciting, but you've got to do 5-year forecasts. Sorry. You allocate then the employment by sector, the model does, and allocates it by industry type. So you see governments using a lot of office space, some institutional space, retail space in some categories, warehouse, flex industrial park. All these have different relationships that are largely, I think, what you'd expect them to be. And then we take that employment forecast by sector and we allocate it to the different types of space. In this case, we break it out between office, institutional, flex, business park, general industrial, warehouse, retail. And we go through allocated to employment zone areas, square foot per employee ratios, comes up with the demand for overall space. You look at a floor area ratio, which is largely consistent with the price points, what we're seeing in your market, assumed market vacancy factor of 10% with the exception of institutional, implied density jobs per acre, which averages out in this case to about 16 jobs per acre, and a total net acres required of about 496 under this case, of which average annual demand for industrial would be about 15.8 acres, and commercial, which includes retail, is about 9. And that's the result of running this thing through the model. We can talk about the scenarios if we want to go up or down or how we play it. But this is a pretty normal hybrid scenario where again, one of the reasons we do a target industry to see if we can do a little bit better and recognize what's really happening. If we took the straight sectoral pieces on manufacturing, we would have to deny the manufacturers that the cities just actually signed recently. So we clearly are growing in manufacturing, and it'd be sort of silly to not recognize that. Again, the firms are small, relatively small. I guess that's a good thing because you only have small sites. But to date, your existing composition of firms have been relatively small, a little bit smaller than the national average. You've got but the issue with smaller firms is what you really need is speculative space development. So that's a different thing. People take a look at it and say, I've got a bunch of firms that are, less than 20 employees. I'm going to need a lot of small sites. But the problem is those firms typically don't actually own their own facilities. They tend to lease or rent facilities. What they really need is someone like a Trammell Crow to build them a flex business park that they can lease pieces out as they grow their business or just operate their business. And so we take a look at these and it looks like it should be a small mix, but in reality, a lot of those will be rolled up into spec buildings. So it won't necessarily be all small developments that house small firms.
Mhm.
We talked to several brokers and developers active in the area. The things they really think are the key advantages for Sherwood are your housing availability, your housing stock, very good, both for executive and workforce housing. A nice range of housing alternatives. The school district, very strong. And your proximity to Sunset Corridor through the back routes. So you don't have to go into Portland. You've got shots to run up on the backside and get into be part of the whole Sunset Corridor concentration. As well as obviously you can come in 99 as well, and get to I-5. The distance to I-5 makes it really challenging for you to be a distribution site, large scale distribution site. Most of the distributions can be smaller regional because of your distance from I-5.
Which sort of means, Jerry, that what's happening in Woodburn with, well, and I know it's on hold, but that massive Amazon facility is probably not very likely in Sherwood.
Yeah, no, unlikely. We worked on the marketing of that Amazon facility with Greg for a long time. Glad that finally happened. And I'm sure he's glad it happened when it did, because Amazon's put a halt to all that stuff for a sec right now too. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know how you'd ever solve the transportation problem of putting that many trucks into Sherwood. I don't know where that would be solved. So we've got projected land needs of about 496 net acres over the next 20 years. And net acres means you've got to take out infrastructure. One advantage is you have with having a bunch of small sites, you probably don't lose a lot to infrastructure because they're little dinky sites. But it's something you have to look at when you go through is, how do I actually serve these? So I have to put a road network through. Am I going to lose some percentage to the road networks? And this is an aggregate need as opposed to a site need. And we always stress this, that if your demand was exactly identical to supply and that you needed exactly the mix of sites as you had, then your aggregate could match. So if I needed 300 acres and I had 300 acres, that's great, but it's unlikely that the 300 acres are the right 300 acres. If I need a 50-acre site, I'm out of luck, right? So if that's one of my pieces, don't have that. So we have to take a look at our mix and try to make sure that we're responsive to sites as well. You've got in your inventory, you still have some oddball sites. You've got that one super long, skinny one. You've got some strange sites in there that give you some acreage, but I'm not sure how you ever match that up with anything. And we did not include any inclusive piece for incremental site to support the CHIP recruitment effort. That's sort of been an independent thing going on. I don't know how involved Sherwood is or isn't with that. I know
We're pretty involved.
The region's been talking about it. The state's been talking about it. If you need a large site, you don't have one. We don't have a need in here for a large site for a chip-related manufacturer or support use. To me, that's sort of an exogenous thing. If somewhere along the line, the state comes to a decision or the region comes to a decision that they want to do this and, they want to put their big site, I don't know, maybe they put it in Hillsborough, you still might have a shot at some, support uses or downstream, upstream uses to the chip manufacturer that maybe you'd have a shot at because you do have that proximity to the corridor. And who knows, maybe they put it in Wilsonville. I have no idea. Or maybe the state may do nothing on this as well. So I don't know. In any case, we didn't really incorporate it. I just sort of raise it up that it's being talked about. Maybe it comes in. We're not counting on it for the need piece, but
well, hey, Jerry, so we know that I think many of us saw, I think it was a Business Oregon RFI that came out looking for, I've forgotten how many acres now for chip manufacturing, some kind of a fab plant. I want to say it was 200, 300, 500. I don't remember anymore. And I know that we didn't respond because we knew we didn't have a site for it. But I don't know that anybody, Susanna might know, but I don't know if, or Stu might know, if anybody in Oregon was able to fill that opportunity. This was about 6-8 months ago.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yes, there are sites of that size.
I mean, I know they've got sites that big.
They're not in population centers.
Oh, yeah, that's what I
the
mean,
issue.
within areas they want to be in.
Yeah, they're not in population centers. You're going to find them downstate. You're going to find them in Klamath Falls. You're going to find them in Eastern Oregon in some spots. They're 200 acres of zone land, but to think that a chip plant's going to locate in a location like that with a low population density is absurd.
Yeah, right. Because I was kind of expecting that Hillsborough might be able to respond, but apparently nobody responded with sites in Oregon. At least that's what either Business Oregon or Greater Portland Inc. told me.
I thought Hillsborough had a few left in the North Hillsborough.
But I thought too.
They're not zoned yet and they're not annexed.
Oh, that's the area. What is that? The area
Jackson
The-
East.
Yeah,
Jackson East, I
Evergreen.
think. Is
Yeah,
North Plains will have that many coming in too here shortly, I believe. It should be approved by the state and they'll have 200 contiguous acres.
That's good. Yeah, that's certainly needed if we want to be competitive in this industry, according to the task force report, this competitiveness task force report.
Yeah. It's
Okay,
like-
I was just wondering.
Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry. Oh, yours, Jerry.
You're the boss, Bruce. You're my-
No, you continue with your report. Sorry.
No, so I mean, just the finding piece I was pulling out, just basically, I was reiterating what I would said before. Now that you don't have a large site for a large user, some of these large sites are really desirous for people who are trying to do multi-tenant business park type pieces. You can scale those quite small, so you don't need a huge site for that. But those groups will, like to do that in some level of scale because there's some real advantages. And ongoing coordination with the regional chip manufacturing efforts. You should support it, even if you don't get it. It's good for the region. And everything that's good for the region is good for everybody. We keep trying to tell Portland this all the time. They're in a zero-sum game all the time that, if the chip manufacturer doesn't go to Hillsborough, that it's going to go to Portland as opposed to Austin, right? It's like that's not who you're not who you're losing this thing to. But in any case, that's what we've got on the land side. So let me turn off the share here. One of the key things right away is you're going to have a mismatch, even at an aggregate level, with demand in your inventory. Your inventory is fairly limited. You've had a lot of growth. It seems like there's some support for trying to do something about it. And we can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, once we start reconciling it and clarifying what that looks like, you've got to start talking about what can I do about that? Are there other options that I can do to sort of address that issue? And, just sort of setting up the case. It's not unheard of that you've got an EOA that says we've got a problem here. You're in a different situation because you're within Metro, right? So you don't have control of your urban growth boundary anyways. You can sit there and have a finding that, look, I've got a problem. I don't think I've got enough employment land. My EOA seems to indicate that. And I think your recourse is that you have to go to Metro and say, hey, I've got a problem here. And you won't be the only jurisdiction in the metro area saying, hey, we've got a problem here. But I think at the end of the day, that's where this thing is litigated. Not to say litigated. Unfortunately, our land use system is litigated all the time. It's a sad state of affairs. But the people who are going to basically make decisions about what can be done are going to be at the metro level. And we'll work more to refine, what you need, what it looks like, how your demand really matches up to your supply, what are the real needs, and clarify that the best we can, and try to set up the case. But I think if you want to do something about the land supply, that's where you have to go.
Eric, what is the scope of this exercise? Are we just arriving at an analysis and then this goes to the planning commission and the council to make recommendations about what to do with deficits? Or does this exercise result in recommendations in and of itself to the planning commission? Like courses of action, like Mr. Johnson speaking of?
Yeah. Erica? Or Erica, you want to take that one?
It'll set a little bit of both, Daniel. So it'll have a set of recommendations in the report, and strategies to, further develop, parcels that we might be missing in size, and maybe it'll set some strategies for assembling smaller parcels. So it'll set like a strategy for council to review and some aspirations, but it'll also tell us, but it will also let us know, you know, our, if we have a deficit.
Yeah, and that's going to mean that documentation is super important here. Thanks for the presentation. I have like a ton of questions, but I don't know how far in the weeds we want to get here, because there's a 20-year forecast, or I mean, look at your crystal ball, you know, and there's a lot of different methodologies you can take. Maybe if you could just kind of speak high level a bit, because I mean, you came up with a very specific number for 20 years out.
Right.
So, and you mentioned that's kind of I don't know if you used the word, but kind of like a baseline forecast. Do you have probabilities surrounding this, like an upside, downside, 10%, 30%? Like, here's what range of outcomes you could look at through your models, and hopefully you're going to have some documentation of these models too. I'd like to take a look at drivers and assumptions and all that.
Oh yeah, we'll have all the documentation for the models. It's very discrete number where we have no confidence. I can guarantee you it's wrong. It's 20-year forecast. It's just a matter of degree, right?
Yep.
Probably when you do,
we struggle with 9-quarter forecasts and
go for the cone of years out, it's really wide. So it's either a complete disaster, a stunning success, or somewhere in between, right? We tried to give 3 and we picked sort of the one in the middle, but and the first 2 are just sort of standard ways you do it. You look at your trends, you look at what the states think the trends are in your region by industry, and then we basically truncated some, recognized some, and moved them. So they've been bounced around in that third one. But yeah, it comes up to be very discrete. In reality, you know, there's a low level of confidence in 496. There's a high level of confidence maybe that is somewhere between, you know, 300 and 800. And there's always a tautological problem with land needs and inventory. And then honestly, if you don't have it, it will not come.
Yeah.
And so you won't need it, right? So you can get yourself caught in a circle there where I didn't accommodate it. Like if I didn't accommodate any housing and nobody moved to the neighbor area, I'd say, look, it worked. Nobody moved. I didn't need any housing. So if you can't build more industrial, you will not get more industrial. And so therefore it'll all work out.
But that's interesting, because your model is based on historical employment trends, which themselves would have been based on the availability of land.
Right.
So we're using, historical availability of land is feeding the data to determine what our future availability of land should be. So we have a potential problem there. I'm just wondering how you've thought about that.
You do, and you're the person who's ever brought that up, but it's actually a good point. One of the issues you run into, like if 20 years ago you had some of Hillsborough's assets, like you had the Sunset Station power grid, and you had large plots of land because of failed real estate deals in the World's Fair of 1910 or something, which actually happened. I think that was but and you had some of these assets in place. You guys might have been a big tech corridor. You may have been the Sunset Corridor along that, right? As opposed to 26. It just, these things come about because a lot of it because you have the assets. There's a reason those things happen. And so the fact that you didn't have the assets at the time, maybe that's why it didn't happen. I mean, I remember Sherwood back in the days when it was a little tiny town, and I'm dating myself even just like Bruce, in that we worked with Yunki Yoshida when they were first doing a steeplechase, which was the first residential development in Sherwood of any scale. And Sherwood had never seen any permits. They had a circuit planner at the time that worked like 2 days a week.
Really?
Then one year, Tualatin ran out of land, and Sherwood pulled like 1,100 permits the next year, and things moved.
Well, I think sorry.
Is that approach of taking the previous and applying to the future? I mean, that I assume that is set though, Jerry, by the state, or is that a unique? Is that a unique
You're allowed to be, I would say you're allowed to be aspirational, not delusional, where you can look out and say, look, we can push the envelope a bit. We just can't get nuts.
I can speak to that a little bit too, Jerry, if you'd like. Yeah. So it's not always the case that, you know, a previous constrained supply of employment land is going to inform that going forward. That is, however, a way that some communities sort of determine what their economic development vision is going forward. They might not want to grow very much, and you know, preventing themselves from having those growth opportunities does become that reinforcing cycle where you know, they're able to invest in you know, other community assets that they're interested in. But like Jerry said, it's possible to be aspirational. It's possible to be quite aspirational, in fact, under the Division 9 rules, and that allows communities to deviate from you know, what their prior growth has looked like, but there does need to be good rationale backing it up. So it's really important that EOAs that are relying on employment projections that don't necessarily reflect what was going on in, you know, the prior 10 or 20 year period, that they have very good reasoning for you know, stating expected growth is going to be much greater than it has been in the past. And we're in a really interesting economic period right now. So I think it's possible for many communities that envision a different economic development future than the one that they've been experiencing, you know, to draw on lots of different trends that are occurring right now and see where it takes them.
It's interesting.
Yep.
You do get big deviations from historic patterns quite often, and it changes rather rapidly. I mean, we've been doing on the other side, on the housing side, in like Sisters, Oregon, the telecommuting piece became a huge push on residential demand in Sisters, Oregon, because people could suddenly telecommute, and they've got people from the Bay Area moving to Sisters to telecommute because they can. I don't know if they're getting called back now to the office. I don't know.
Or laid off.
Or they got laid off, so they don't have a job anymore. But they probably bought it cash so they can hang out for a while anyways. But you know, these things change a lot, and certainly the pandemic has altered a lot of pieces. And Leah, you brought up the fact, which is, I've seen this, we've worked with jurisdictions that don't want to grow. Their aspiration is that nothing happens, and you can accomplish that. That's doable. It's sort of onward decline. If you want to just freeze, you can try to do that. But a lot of people have been very specific too. I mean, we work with a lot of coastal communities that say, like, we don't want big box retail or something, and they'll just put in their code. You can do a lot of things. You don't have to aspire to growth. My understanding is, you know, Sherwood at this point in time is, you know, would like to see economic development and is highly supportive of it, but, you know, you may be very specific about which economic development you like and what you want to see.
But we should still understand what the demand for growth is, even if we choose not to provide it. You know, and I think that's part of what this analysis is helping us do.
It is, however, a requirement of the state that the city supply 20 years worth of employment land through this process. And so it's really just a matter of how it is that you define that demand.
Right. Yeah, this becomes difficult again because you don't have end control. And this every jurisdiction in the metro region deals with this. That, you know, if they recognize they need or don't need land, it's not really to them.
You know, I'm glad that you brought that back up, Jerry, because I was going to say, I obviously don't represent Metro, and DLCD does not make decisions about urban growth boundaries for jurisdictions within the Metro region. But, you know, obviously we've been in quite a few conversations with Metro about industrial land need over the past 6 months or so. And my understanding is that Metro has not denied a UGB expansion application for employment land in the last 10 years. I think 4 out of 4 requests that they received for employment land expansions were approved. So
that's a good thing. I mean, one of the problems Metro has is they adopted an urban growth report a few years ago that said they didn't need any industrial land for the next 20 years.
Wow.
That there was negative demand for industrial for 20 years. I think it's a deeply flawed report. Nonetheless, that's for Metro, sort of the law of the land right now. But
Jerry, where did you see that report? I'm sorry.
It's the urban growth report. It comes out every 5 years from Metro.
It's
And
the
how long ago was
2018.
that one?
It's
How
on
long-
the website. I could send you copies too.
I'd love to see that.
It's because they projected manufacturing would be negative. Manufacturing growth would be negative for the next 20 years. And so they came up with the demand that you don't need any industrial for 20 years.
I think that will be up for revision next year, though.
It'll be a
So,
That is
Yeah.
correct.
yeah. So,
Yeah,
the better case that Sherwood is making right now, to help inform that, I think.
yeah.
The
And
stronger
I think
position
you
you'll be
guys
in.
will be chipping in with a lot of other jurisdictions that are saying, well, that's not consistent with our experience.
Hey, Jerry, I've got a question. So obviously, we've seen a tremendous amount of, for a city this size, a tremendous amount of manufacturing and industrial land or industrial development happening really recently. I don't know if that's pretty much because land closer to the I-5 freeway in the metro boundary there's not much left, at least within the metro boundary, without jumping to, to Woodburn or places down towards Salem for such for manufacturing. So I'm wondering how, if the aspirational approach of the city council is manufacturing and tech and that kind of thing, and maybe less so for, I'm making this up, but less so for certain kinds of retail, or because this is not a sales tax state. How does that get factored into this analysis? I'm not sure I understand that.
I mean, this becomes one of your issues. If you don't have enough capacity for everything, right? But
Right.
you can be selective about what you're actually, how am I going to allocate my capacity to? Here's what I really want to encourage. I mean, one of the issues with the commercial demand for retail is, yes, it'll always show demand, relative growth with normal ratios of, household spending, employee spending, how much retail that supports. Retailers are very scalar in what they can accomplish. The same grocery store may do $500 a square foot in one location, but if business is better, they may be doing $800 a square foot. You didn't really add more grocery store. They're just doing better.
Yeah.
So the relationship isn't always the same. The other issue you've got in commercial, and this has been with the rise of online shopping, is a lot of your brick and mortar commercial demand is now really industrial fulfillment center demand. It's a different thing now, and you've got deliveries happening and a little bit less on the actual brick and mortar ground retail.
I can add to that. One of the what do you want to say, seismic shifts that's occurred in the last 3 or 4 years. It was accelerated by COVID, certainly, but it's ingrained now in consumers' habits that when you see these delivery warehouses like Amazon, Walmart, fulfillment centers, even food providers, I mean, all that stuff comes off of the retail shelves. And, a lot of jurisdictions look down at warehousing, as we know, but the reason the demand is there for that product is because of consumer demand. They can look down their nose at it, but they're driving the demand. I mean, everybody in this room can look around themselves and say, I order from Amazon all the time. And yet they don't like their use because there's what do you want to say, an image that all these trucks are clogging up traffic, when in fact they're taking cars off the road. Every study I've ever seen says that, this many trips are saved by these trucks, but there's a snobbery that's going around, especially in the metro area, about these uses, even though they pay very well. I was involved in a study with Wilsonville last year or 2 years ago, I guess, where they were looking at should we have they wanted to create an incentive program, and they had, at the time, I guess this is maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they had a Microsoft assembly plant down there for flat screens, and the wages that they paid and the jobs they had didn't qualify, but Columbia Distributing, who was looking around at that time, did qualify for the incentive program. So I just want to point that out, that it's sad that a lot of these are getting sent down I-5 further and further out, where the delivery costs are going to be longer, and if you want to get into it, the damage to the environment probably a lot longer as well.
Yeah, they go north on I-5 too, Stu.
Yeah, I mean, they're in Ridgefield. I mean, it's,
Yeah,
you know,
Ridgefield.
Ridgefield and Woodburn.
they're serving the metro area from outlying areas, which is just adding to fuel costs, and I mean, and adding to traffic on I-5 too as well. Or if you had smaller these pods in communities, the trips would be shorter, they'd be more frequent. And it's unfortunate that it's got what I would consider bad publicity.
Our code, all of our code and industrial areas allow warehousing, Stu. So,
Yeah, I'm well aware of that.
Stu knows in our employment industrial zone.
I want to point out something else about Metro too, and the supply of industrial land. There is a great deal of industrial land in Wilsonville and Tualatin that's not served, it's not developable. And the plans are, Wilsonville actually has no plans to service most of their industrial land at this point. Yet Tualatin is working on a urban renewal agency or an urban renewal bond, but it's 5 years out. And it's so that's one of the big problems. I mean, Metro might anoint these cities with the land, but as Jerry pointed out, a lot of them don't want to do it. They don't want to grow. And so the land sits there fallow, and that contributes to it actually is, in my opinion, the main reason we have a shortage of industrial land right now.
Yeah, a lot of those sites, and we've done that with McKenzie for years, several iterations running through there with Business Oregon. And NAAP and everybody, just taking a look at the sites and the infrastructure costs for the sites and how can you actually serve these. I think the Tonkin employment area was one of those, talking about all of the challenges to get the infrastructure in. And industrial is difficult. Historically, it's been difficult to meet a lot of those challenges and offsite improvement costs because the land values have been relatively low. Of late, industrial land values are not relatively low. So maybe used to be the way to deal with that is you rezoned it to commercial, right? But
I was gonna add that Eric and I worked this morning. I think it was a survey that was done by OETA, which is the Oregon Economic Development Association, in cooperation with the League of Cities, and I think with Oregon Business and Industry. And it was an industrial land use survey that we just completed, which really effectively showed that, because they asked you what size parcels do you have that are available. It was that kind of a survey. And basically we indicated we have 130-acre parcel that meets that particular criteria. And the rest of it was really small parcels under multiple ownerships. And so at least from my perspective, we don't have the land base to really be able to compete for some of these, even for smaller businesses, as Jerry was saying, in terms of they need the multi-tenant space, let alone for the larger businesses and the campus style projects that could go in and be suppliers to semiconductor industry or something of that sort. There's just a real limit in this city in terms of what's available.
All right, well, we've got a lot to chew on with this. I mean, we went through this stuff pretty quick, but there wasn't as much to talk about this time. The big issue is going to come down to, what to do about this when it's all said and done. We'll clarify, write everything up, get all the methodologies laid out and bring it up. And I think maybe the next time we meet, it just comes down to sort of this final reconciliation and, brainstorming on policy ideas. What can the city do? How do we proceed going forward if this is a combination of things that are both findings of the report and maybe next steps, identifying what those next steps will be.
So should we talk about that next meeting and how long we should be planning before the next meeting should take place? Obviously, we're going into the holidays, but any thoughts, Jerry, in terms of how much time you might need?
For me, just to get it ready and to write everything up, I mean, I'd like to do maybe the third week in January. The holidays just gets really hard.
Yeah, that's why I was asking.
We get a meeting scheduled. I'm actually surprised we got this one scheduled. I didn't think that was going to happen. We had a low turnout because of it. But
will there be material provided prior to it, like your write-up or something, or some?
Yeah,
of
well,
that way we can get a chance
everything
to peruse it.
beforehand. Yeah, so you can go.
Okay. Okay.
And I think just to clarify, Daniel, we'll probably have at some point, maybe this isn't right, but I believe we'll have like an actual draft report for the TAC, or is that after the TAC before Planning Commission, Jerry?
I think we'll get a draft report to the TAC without the, the strategic next steps piece.
Right, without the
Strategy next step.
policies, yeah.
We'll work with that with the TAC to put that in, but make sure the other findings are available so we can have an informed discussion.
Yeah. So I think you'll get probably a pretty cleaned up, draft first few sections of the report, and then that will sort of inform the discussion for the policy recommendations, if I'm hearing it right.
Mm-hmm.
That then we would add to the report before we take it to Planning Commission. But the product of these meetings is going to be a draft economic opportunities analysis for consideration at Planning Commission for your recommendation to City Council.
Right.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, just the more time in advance to review material, the better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So is there anything else we need to go over? I think what we'll do is we'll probably do a doodle poll to see availability, let's say the third week in January, and schedule it and be sure to get you the report earlier. Any sense as to how much time you would like to review the report? Maybe I shouldn't ask that.
Well, it depends on how many questions I have. I don't know. I don't want to reinvent the wheel or anything.
No, I don't know.
Anyway.
If maybe it's good to maybe chat with one of us offline as well and kind of go over stuff, because I know you have a background in this type of reporting and methodology of the projection. So if you're seeing stuff and you need to go over it in a little bit more detail outside of this meeting, I think we could set something up maybe before the meeting or just whenever between now and the next meeting, if you want to chat more about the information in this packet.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. I'll work with whatever timelines this group needs, but the earlier the better would be helpful.
Sure.
You got it. Super. Thanks. So is there anything else that we want to go over while we're all together? Not hearing anything. I want to wish.
Sorry. The map of buildable lands, I'm curious to see that. It's just interesting to think about how many of those 95 acres are going to be are popular or good locations. Talking about the Amazon factor, we're running into this from a lot of jurisdictions, just the resistance to industrial near residential, or in some cases near commercial. People just trying to get rid of industrial not in our city, it should go somewhere else in the region. So regardless of where, unless it's surrounded by industrial, I'm just curious to see where we're looking, like
where the
zoning
There are two
perspective.
very good sites for that. There's two very good sites, one of which I represent, obviously, the Schnitzer project. We have a large site there, that 50 acres of which we're going to develop about half of here shortly, one of these days. And then adjacent to that is a 40-acre parcel too that will be developed. So
you've got most of the 95 acres, right? Or
no, I don't.
You're aware
I have 50 of the we have.
So
50.
they're all kind of in one spot.
Yeah, they're all in the Tonkin area,
Okay.
East Oregon, north of Tonkin Road.
Yeah, you can see this map here. So
Yeah.
I wasn't quite sure what you were trying to get to, Susanna, but most of our buildable land is going to be in the Tonkin employment area, which I guess would be our eastern boundary, kind of on the Tualatin Sherwood Road corridor. So this is going to be the chunk here, and we really don't see a whole lot of challenges like you are mentioning. So, we do have a residential neighborhood here, but we've already approved these land use applications here, and we got no comments from the general public about, residential and those impacts. So it's pretty, nice separated
Yeah.
employment area here. Some little kind of infill within our commercial areas along Highway 99 is the other
Mhm.
area, mainly for commercial.
Yeah, that's-
Mhm.
I guess the other industrial would be just along Tualatin Sherwood Road here in some mixed opportunities. And then Brookman is the last area, just some commercial and industrial here.
And that area is challenged by multiple ownerships and multiple zonings in that particular area.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
those-
You're referring to Brookman, right?
Yeah,
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 Brookman.
that's a mess down there.
yeah.
So really Tonkin employment area and Tualatin Sherwood Road is our industrial, and then Highway 99 is some of our commercial, and just a little bit of both in Brookman, and that's kind of it. And then really the core around Cedar Creek of our city is all residential
Mhm.
in the downtown.
So it'd be interesting to hear, Susanna, your evaluation working for McKinsey, because you work with a lot of tricky industrial sites around Metro Portland, and it'd be interesting to hear your evaluation of some of the remaining sites, quite frankly.
Mhm. Sure. Well, it sounds like a couple of them are already being marketed for
Yeah.
industrial development, so there's probably some pretty good understanding of what the issues are there, if there's wetlands or infrastructure, needs. That gets at what I think I mentioned I forget, it's come up, I think, in these meetings before, kind of the tiers, looking at development readiness.
Mhm.
And like, okay, sure, you've got this vacant property, but it's gonna take way more. Or like the stuff at the Brookman area or something, like there's obviously something wrong with it. Like you can't just call it ready to be developed. But then some of this stuff is gonna come off the inventory soon. So if most of the 95 acres is gonna be developed ASAP, then that affects it's just not just a number. But sure, yeah, I'm curious about that too. I know when we did our tour, Bruce, driving around the Tonkin area, there were some access issues. I know that McKinsey's done some analysis of like infrastructure here, and it's changed a lot since we did. That was at 20.
Yeah, 15.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yep.
So yeah, it sounds like some discussion with city public works engineering, that kind of thing, about areas that could be served, could be valuable.
Yeah, mostly what we've got is, I think we have one tier 1 site, as I read the definition, which is start construction within 6 months. If that's how I remember the.
That's fast.
And that's, yeah. And
Yeah.
we have one site that could be in that role, and that's about, I'm going to say about 30-ish acres in Tonkin. I think anything after that is tier 2. And I don't have that in front of me, but tier 2 is, I think, 2 years.
6 months to 2 years.
Yeah,
6 to 2.
less than 2.5 years, something like that, but greater than 6 months. So we have a little bit in the tier 2, but I think mostly we're in the tier 3, which is really the lands that are really not, they're not ready. They're not ready, probably well past 2.5 years for consideration. So that's how I understand that the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 in this state.
Yeah, the other thing that we talked about is, it's not even on this map, is I don't know that it can be part of this analysis, but certainly for this group, is the other areas that you showed me on our tour, which are to the north of all this, and you're looking at future UGB expansion area.
Right.
And
that's the Sherwood West area that
scroll up maybe.
Has, right, that's in the urban reserve, and it has the potential for creating it's larger parcels, but you could create larger sites from that I think could really meet, and it's not just semiconductors, but could really meet what the Semiconductor Task Force report, I think it says Seize the Opportunity is the name of that report, talks about as being a place for that industry, suppliers to that industry, and maybe some smaller fab plants or whatever, because I think we're then getting into those kinds of acreage. We're not getting into the massive acreage that sometimes that industry needs, 500 acres or whatever, but we're getting into sites that could accommodate larger users anyway.
I'm just curious, what is Metro's involvement in some of this? I mean, we're talking about these massive sites. And I mean, it seems like there's only so many of those that can be placed in the greater metro area. So how does this work? Do we just like, oh, Sherwood needs that because every economic opportunity analysis says that a city needs one? Well, from Metro standpoint, they might want it somewhere else other than just small town Sherwood taking up half the city size.
Mhm.
That's an exaggeration, but you see where I'm going. So if we say, oh yeah, these are in demand, is there some other jurisdiction that goes, yeah, but the placement for that in the greater area is elsewhere?
You know, I've not been here through the Metro cycle. I've only been here for 3 years and I've never been through the whole thing, but I don't think they do that from what I've been told. And what I also understand is that if you need a 300-acre site, you need more than one 300-acre site in the metro area. I mean, Stu knows, we just we're involved in giving a tour to a company. It's a European company, an industrial company that's looking at Sherwood. And I know they've been looking around elsewhere in the Portland region. And so they're looking for a particular site and they want maybe 3 or 4 sites they can look at so they can make the evaluation. So there really does need to be sort of a I'm going to use the term redundancy, I think, in that, so that when business is looking in Greater Portland, we have a shot at it, but so does Hillsborough, so does maybe, I don't know, so does maybe Gresham if they have the land of that type. So I think that's really important to have more than one site that can meet the need of a company or many companies.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
The
I
market-
want to point out something. Hillsborough is very aggressive about annexing and zoning land. And, you know, obviously they've got a base out there with Intel and some of the other semiconductors as well as their suppliers. So they just go out and they do it. I mean, they're doing it out in that Jackson area that has been referred to several times. Our company's pretty involved in that. North Plains is the same way. They're outside of Metro's jurisdiction, by the way. And you know, those cities are pretty aggressive and they want this stuff. And it's not just Intel, you know, it's the whole industrial, what do you want to say, ecosystem. We always talk about these big users, but really the choking out there is coming on many of the smaller companies that can't find land to expand to or space even to get to. I'm aware of several instances right now where tenants are fighting over space. You know, in this area down here, we absorbed about 1 million square feet this year. That was what was built. On the books next year is about half that much. And I anticipate that's probably about right. Just because, you know, we're experiencing a slowdown in velocity for sure with the Federal Reserve tightening credit. But the 5-year outlook is grim. I just don't see land in this area available to meet what will be the annual demand in a normal year for 5 years, certainly. Just as a point of reference, it's hard for me to imagine that happening.
And I mean, the implication of that, I think, is pretty significant, because if there's not a sufficient supply of industrial land, companies and site selectors are not going to bring those companies here. They're going to know that. And they're going to look at, frankly, we all compete as regions, because it is a region that we have to look at, not just Sherwood and not just Hillsborough, but as a region. And we have competitors out there from Salt Lake City to Denver to Phoenix to you name it. And I'm not even thinking about an Austin, because Portland is not in that category of an Austin, Texas, even though we're the same size metro. But in terms of who are our peers, peer competing regions, Charlotte is a peer competing region. You know, for example, that's a similar population size. And if we don't have the sites, we're not going to get the jobs. And the way I look at it, then you don't have the opportunity for equity and diversity growth and that kind of thing in this region. So it has a spillover effect. And that's why, at least for me as an economic developer, I think it's really important that we, not just Sherwood, but the region as a whole, be able to grow at the appropriate locations for higher paying jobs or family wage jobs or whatever, which is really what advanced manufacturing can be.
You know, again, going back to what I said, I just like to take care of the people that we have here.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that, I mean, I can tell you, if you talk to many of the manufacturing companies and warehousing companies and wholesalers, and everybody is in the same boat. They cannot find space. They can't find land to buy or build. I've seen several companies, seeing one right now that's in Tualatin, locate to Phoenix because of the availability of space and I think it's in that case it's land.
Mhm.
And I've seen 2 others move to Texas this year or expand in Texas because it's not here.
You know, I know that
And these are companies that are already hiring people and they may end up following the whole thing there. That's what I fear.
I mean,
So-
I can see what you're saying, Stu. It's not just recruitment of businesses from outside this area to here. A lot of it is trying to keep the companies that we have so they don't leave for more accessible locations in other regions.
I
So I think
it's
that's the
main-
challenge that this region is facing, and Sherwood is a part of this larger region. And we have an
Yeah.
opportunity to try to address some of these issues on our scale.
To me, it's the most urgent thing we're facing as a broker. I can tell you that when I see companies, this one company in Tualatin in particular is affiliated with Fritz, and you know, they're not going to expand here because there isn't anything. It's too bad.
You
Right,
mentioned
but we-
accessibility. Are roads a component of that? Or is demand, I mean, I assume demand would be affected by roads, which are becoming increasingly packed. We hardly ever build new ones, especially freeways. Is that a factor to anybody or?
You know, I don't really think so. I mean, you know, the problem with the roads, David, is that so many of the citizens in the communities don't want any growth because the roads are at capacity. So that's one of the reasons you don't have this land being developed, in my opinion, or there's any urgency to serve it. So that in that way, it's an issue. But from the standpoint of the companies that I'm speaking of, no, that's not the problem. Labor is something of an issue for them, but more than anything, it's just they can't get the facilities or they can't find land to buy to build on. I mean, if you looked at a land inventory of what's for sale right now and in South I-5, I mean, we talk about 95 acres. What a company can buy to build their own facility there is right now, as far as I can tell, about 20. So
Yeah.
very difficult.
I mean, the other factor is that I know of companies that have approached me, and they probably approached Stu and other brokers that are they're in, for example, Portland or in Tigard. And we don't go out and look for companies that are within this area because we're not trying to take companies from one city to another. As a city, we don't do that. We understand that the brokers very often know of those things, and we're going to certainly welcome that kind of investment. But I know of companies that would love to be in Sherwood and would like to buy property, not lease it, but buy property of a certain size. Those sites don't exist. I've turned down, quite frankly, a number of them that would love to be in Sherwood and be able to grow here, but just can't do it because there's no land that's for sale that meets their requirements and that has the infrastructure.
Very, very true. Like I say, I think it's the biggest problem we face, and if the economy does pick up, it's going to be a pretty critical juncture here in the next couple of years, in my opinion.
Which brings us back to baselines and forecasts and documentation, and off we go.
Yeah, we can get all your baseline forecasts together. You know, one of the issues, this is something like Stu, I get on the brokers. I've got a lot of friends who are brokers, and telling them that the industrial land was going to be a real problem 10 years ago, and nobody wanted to listen to it because they're thinking 3 years off. And it's like, you know, the land use system moves very slowly. It's turning a large ship. You've got to get way ahead of it if you want any action. I mean,
the reason why, I think one of the reasons why Intel, I mean, I'm not privy to this, but one of the reasons why Intel selected a large site in Ohio is because they could, and because the state stepped in, and from what I've been told, the state stepped in and the municipalities worked together to try to create a large enough site so that Intel could put a major facility just I think it's west of Columbus, and to do that is really challenging. I'm just being honest here, I'm still, I guess, an outsider, but fairly new to Oregon, but it's really challenging to try to do that type of thing in Oregon. And I think Oregon, and particularly the legislature and the new governor, have to be thinking about, we hope they'll be thinking about, how does Oregon remain competitive and prosperous in the future. And so I think those are some of the main issues that we're going to be facing. And again, we're a small city, but we have a big vision. I think the city council has a big vision for what they'd like to see in terms of the growth of technology and advanced manufacturing in the city. And so we're delighted to be able to work with Jerry and you to try to expand, try to create those opportunities in accordance with these aspirational goals of the council.
I wonder if do those other states have planning structures like we do with urban growth boundaries? Can't build outside of it, have to build inside of it, and these processes are.
This is, I think, and you guys can correct me on this, but I think it's fairly unique to Oregon. I mean, every state has their issues. A lot of states, and I don't like to compare us to Texas. This is a very different culture than Texas, and it does never want to be like Texas, I'm sure. But there's a lot of states, particularly in the South, that have been hungry for growth because they came out of poverty in essence, and they look at it a little bit differently. Often this state is thought of as a little bit more like California. California doesn't have urban growth boundaries to the same extent that we do, but it's just our land use laws have done some great things. They protected farmland, they protected forest land. But in life, from my point of view, there needs to be a balance. If you want to have a more prosperous economy, then you need to have some kind of a balance in terms of how that works. And I may not be saying the most popular things, but at least that's how I see it as fairly a newcomer and an economic developer in this particular city.
Yeah, I would add to that, Bruce. I'd say at a minimum, we don't want to, hamstring ourselves or restrict ourselves, kind of like the discussion we had earlier, about the growth. So, hopefully as a planner, hopefully we can do both, protect natural resources and find suitable sites, protect the natural resources within those sites and get the jobs. I mean, that's the idea. It's the planner idealist in me, but hopefully we can do all that.
Yeah, well, that's how the legislation's written, Eric.
Makes sense to me.
All supposed to be about balance.
Conservation and development.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. Touche. It's in the name.
So, is there anything else we should cover?
No, I don't think we're going to solve the land use system.
No, we're not.
But let's just work with what we got.
We gotta figure out how to work within the structures that we've got and try to progress. And so I just want to wish everybody a great Thanksgiving.
Likewise.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Enjoy it.
All right. Are we done?
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Yep. See ya.
Bye.
See you in 2023.
Okay. Bye-bye.